In this video, we'll be looking at some of the more fun and overpowered racials that were removed from WoW up until Dragonflight. This will include a handful of abilities that are in the modern game, but only in name only, since those abilities in the past are completely different from how they are in the modern game. First up at number 10, we have Plainsrunning. This is one of the Torrent's racial abilities added in the WoW's alpha, but never made it to the actual live game. Now, let's hoof it and delve a little deeper into the Plainsrunning ability. Torrents live in rolling grassy plains of Mulgore, which surround their capital, Thunderbluff. Given their shamanistic lifestyle, appreciation of nature, and massive stature, the original intention was for Torrents to not have animal mounts, and instead be able to run as fast as a mount. However, the massive limitations this placed on Torrents versus regular players with mounts became too hard to ignore. A particular grievance was the fact that Torrents had to run straight for 10 seconds before the speed boost kicked in. And every time the Torrent was hit or would stop, the buff would immediately be lost and the Torrent would have to run for another 10 seconds to reapply it. Despite Plainsrunning being scrapped, being able to run as fast as a mount is still pretty cool. And Blizzard later returned the idea of Plainsrunning with Worgen added in the Cataclysm expansion. The Worgen have a racial ability called Running Wild, which allows them to get on all fours and run as fast as a mount. Plainsrunning is more of a novel idea, but it does give a small glimpse into the formation of World of Warcraft and its appreciation for its RPG and lore elements. Granted, Plainsrunning was more considered a burden than actually anything too OP, but as an early Torrent racial, it was designed to be different and overpowered, even if that process failed to materialize in actual gameplay. As such, we played Plainsrunning in the number 10 spot, even if it was technically never actually in the live versions of the game. And at number 9 on this list, we have Elune's Grace. In Vanilla, Classic, and the Burning Crusade version of WoW, priests had two specific racial abilities, and these abilities being different based on what race you played. The Night Elf Priest racial Elune's Grace is the interesting one we'll be discussing right now, introduced in Vanilla WoW, and which was removed alongside all the other priest racial spells at the end of the Burning Crusade. With its 5 ranks maxed out, it reduced the damage you took from ranged attacks by a set amount of 95, while also increasing your dodge chance by 10%, allowing you to escape danger or stand your ground for just a final few casts, at least for its 15-second duration. And this was a pretty big spell too, as it had an entire 5-minute cooldown between each use. Yeah, actually not that long for Vanilla WoW, considering how long the cooldowns usually were. With the launch of the Burning Crusade, this spell was changed from 5 ranks to 1, and its effect was simplified, now giving you a 20% chance to avoid direct attacks, ranged or melee, making it an overall buff. Especially so with its duration staying the same, but its cooldown almost halving, going down to 3 minutes. An ability that allowed you to call upon Elune's Grace to become more elusive with dodge and attacks felt like a great thematic divine intervention for Night Elves specifically, with priest racials as a whole being an amazing feel of class fantasy with your class abilities actually being affected by the race you played, and therefore the gods you worshipped and brought power from. There were some downfalls to the spell, however, the main one being that it's classified as a holy spell, which meant that casting it in your shadow form would force you out of shadow form. But Elune's Grace really was an amazing cooldown in case you needed to dodge a couple of attacks, especially so in PvP where it's not abnormal for a healer to get attacked, something usually unheard of in PvE. And at number 8 on this list, we have the Blood Elf racial ability called Magic Resistance. Blood Elves were introduced as a playable race in the Burning Crusade expansion. In TBC, Magic Resistance gave Blood Elves +5 to all magic resistances, which included Arcane, Fire, Nature, Frost, and Shadow. Pretty much everything that you could normally gain resistance to except for Holy, which was a lone exception in WoW. While +5 is nice, in the grand scheme, even by TBC, 5 resistance wasn't anything a gem or enchant couldn't cover. Blizzard saw how even bigger numbers in Wrath would make this racial pretty much useless, and so decided to change the magic resistance racial. For example, in Wrath, Priest's Shadow Protection buff gave a +60 to shadow resistance. And so in Wrath, Blizzard changed the passive racial ability to be an all-encompassing hit resistance by 2%. Blizzard needed to make sure the magic resistance spell still fit thematically with the Blood Elf's extensive use of magic, as well as actually being useful. But in Wrath, by the time the Blood Elf player acquired gear, gems, enchants, and pots, a 2% hit reduction chance didn't really matter too much at all in the grand scheme of things, with numbers rapidly rising tier by tier and season by season. As such, the magic resistance ability was replaced by the ability Arcane Resistance when the Cataclysm expansion came out, which gave you a straight out 1% arcane damage reduction. And Arcane Resistance remains one of the Blood Elves racials in the game to this day. While 1% is barely anything, by Cataclysm, Blizzard had started normalizing the power balance in racials in an attempt to fix the racial imbalance that plagued the game. But it did feel nice to get an extra 1% less arcane damage taken, I guess, and at least made sense lore-wise. And at number 7, we have an ability called the Human Spirit. This is a passive racial trait for all human characters, well, aside for the Kulturan humans, that is. The Human Spirit has been in the game since the very beginning, and in its original iteration in both Classic and Vanilla, it increased the Spirit attribute of players by 5%. Spirit in Classic was primarily used to regen mana, but it also did increase your health regen, which made human characters very popular with caster classes. Spirit is even more so coveted by healers because their role entails being able to cast as many spells as possible in sustained fights. The human spirit also stacked with other outside sources of spirit, such as gear, enchants, and pots. While the numbers aren't too terribly impressive in Classic, the human spirit received a big buff with the launch of WoW's first expansion, the Burning Crusade. When TBC launched, the human spirit's passive 5% to spirit was increased to 10%. There's a reason the abbreviation came into being, and this additional 5% increase was probably meant to give the classes that use mana as a resource a bit of a reprieve. And while in Classic WoW human characters were, as a whole, the most made and most played race in the entire game, Blizzard managed to buff a big percentage of the player base that used mana as well. That is, until the Blood Elf was added, and quickly ate up the massive chunk of the human player base, making Blood Elves the second most played, and quickly ranking the Horde ahead of the Alliance, still leaving the humans with the largest population, however. The issue of spirit and mana regen was largely fixed with the final patch in the TBC, which saw the introduction of the intellect stat granting more mana regen per spirit point. TBC was the apex for the human spirit, as it was nerfed into the ground when Wrath came out. Wrath plummeted the racial ability from 10% to only a 3% increase. To compensate for this, Blizzard made in-combat regeneration much more robust to virtually level out any differences. With the spirit stat being demoted to a secondary stat in WoD and then removed entirely from the game in Legion, the modern version of the human spirit in the game is now just a 2% buff to all sources of the 4 secondary stats: haste, critical strike, mastery, and versatility. So while the human spirit did give players an incredible 10% buff in the Burning Crusade, only a fraction of the player base played classes using mana, so it ends up on the higher end of this list. And at number 6 is the ability Hex of Weakness. Hex of Weakness is a Darkspear troll racial ability. Trolls are known for their hexes, so it made sense thematically for the game devs to give them hex. Hex of Weakness is a double whammy curse. First, it reduces the amount of damage done by the target by a set amount. Secondly, it reduces the healing received by the target by 20%. In Vanilla and Classic, Hex of Weakness had 5 ranks, and in the Burning Crusade, it had 7 ranks. Rank 5 in Classic reduces the damage by 15, and Rank 7 in TBC reduces the damage by 35. As you guessed, the damage reduction wasn't too particularly impressive, but the healing debuff could be quite useful. Slowing down the healing done by bosses to themselves and the healing received by enemy players in PvP, for example, were particularly useful. However, since Hex is a curse, it could also simply be removed by a mage's remove curse ability. Hex of Weakness has a 35-yard range, meaning it can be cast outside of melee range, while also having 0 cooldown with a 2-minute duration. The best part, however, the only part that rank affected was the damage reduction, meaning if you wanted just the healing reduction, you could cast the rank 1 version of the ability, reducing the mana cost drastically. Both of these things meant it could be spammed in PvP, which made things a little more interesting. Don't forget that Hex of Weakness reduced all forms of healing, including those by potions and bandages as well. There really are only a few player abilities that reduce healing on enemies in the game outside of Hex of Weakness, with a few examples being some rogue poisons and Warrior's Mortal Strike. Overall, Hex of Weakness is a pretty funny, unique ability, and it's a shame it got axed when Wrath came out. Perhaps Blizzard wanted to keep away from the voodoo, or perhaps they just simply noticed fun was being had and removed Hex of Weakness. And at number 5, we have Touch of Weakness. This is another one of those racial priest abilities, but this one was used by the undead and later Blood Elf priests. Since patch 1.10, this ability granted a player with a buff that said, the next damaging melee attack against you will damage and weaken the target. There were 7 ranks of the spell in TBC, following an exponential curve in terms of how powerful they were. Rank 1 caused 8 shadow damage to the attacker and reduced their damage by 2 for 2 minutes. Rank 7, on the other hand, did 80 shadow damage and reduced the attacker's damage by 35. As you can see, these numbers aren't that big, even by the Burning Crusade standards. However, Touch of Weakness was quite useful to priests who went to the shadow route with other talents like Shadow Weaving and Blackout, making it way more powerful as a damage reduction. This meant that the true power of Touch of Weakness lied in its defensive properties, and the name itself does imply similarities between it and some of the other Warlock curse abilities. Touch of Weakness is also notable for its usefulness in many different situations. Priests are a caster class, so this defensive spell can be used as a last resort to save the priest's life in a tough situation, like in PvP or certain dungeon and raid mechanics where it's a bit more common to see a few hits directed at the healer. Touch of Weakness was also quite helpful when leveling, as it made mobs easier to solo. Overall, Touch of Weakness was useful as a defensive utility spell, but certainly not the best, which is why it only comes in halfway at number 5. And at number 4, we have another priest racial, this time with the human's feedback ability. This ability is somewhat similar to Touch of Weakness, but instead drains the target's mana instead of attack power, and required the enemy to cast a spell instead of using a melee attack. The tooltip for the rank 5 version of feedback says, the priest becomes surrounded with anti-magic energy. Any successful spell cast against the priest will burn for 105 of the attacker's mana, causing 1 shadow damage for each point of mana burned. Like Touch of Weakness, the true power of this ability comes not from the rather weak amount of damage that it does, but from the fact that it can chew through an opponent's mana. To make sure this ability wasn't completely OP, the buff only lasted for 15 seconds and had a 3-minute cooldown. However, even by classic numbers, 100 mana isn't that much, and while feedback is useful, it's more of an ability that can be the straw that broke the camel's back, rather than a huge heavy hitter. Chewing through mana on a boss that you don't want casting or an enemy healer in PvP is nice, don't get me wrong. But what makes feedback so cool and unique is that it's more of an insidious spell, allowing you to, for example, punish a Moonfire spamming boomkin who is way too focused on your priest. Still, while the numbers from feedback may be somewhat underwhelming, the fact that it's one of the few player abilities in the early game to target an enemy's resource is notable. And while it does have more niche uses, feedback can still be applied on any foe the human priest chooses. The only other drawback to the ability is that the enemy had to use mana as a resource for it to work. While feedback can be brutal, it ultimately helps with making the end product better. However, there would be no feedback on feedback after the Burning Crusade expansion, as it was removed from the game in Wrath along with all the other priest racial spell kindred. And at number 3, we have the original Blood Elf racial, Mana Tap. This ability was only in the game during the Burning Crusade expansion and was used as a charge-up ability for another one of the Blood Elf's racial abilities called Arcane Torrent. Mana Tap steals the enemy's mana and stores on the Blood Elf in the form of a buff. This buff can be gained 3 times, so the Blood Elf can have 3 of these charges. Mana Tap can be repeated after 3 charges, and while it does consume mana again, it just refreshes the duration of the buffs, not adding any more charges. Mana Tap removed 50 mana, and while that may not sound like too terribly much, this ability had a cooldown of 30 seconds, allowing it to easily be spammed. And as we mentioned with feedback at number 4, eating through an opponent's mana is nice. But what makes Mana Tap so unique is that it strengthens the other racial Arcane Torrent, which we'll be getting to shortly. Whereas feedback can only remove roughly 100 mana every 3 minutes, Mana Tap can remove 50 mana every 30 seconds, which is a much faster rate of mana depletion, and why it gets a higher spot on this list. Because 60 mana may not sound like much, but it meant every 30 seconds you could basically remove 1 spellcasting worth of mana from your opponent's mana pool. Mana Tap is so iconic and unique, it can even be seen in the trailer for the Burning Crusade, where a Blood Elf mana taps a mana worm, transforming it into an arcane charge. Mana Tap was removed for 2 reasons in Wrath. First, the Sunwell was restored at the end of the Burning Crusade, meaning Blood Elves could use it as a magic energy source again, and no longer needed to act like mana vampires. Second, it was widely thought that the constant offensive debuffing every 30 seconds and keeping an eye on the 3 buff charges was just too tedious and too much of a hassle for a racial, feeling like almost a full-on class mechanic, and so it was removed when Wrath launched, while Arcane Torrent stayed just with the baseline effect. Overall, however, draining an enemy's mana slowly is better than not at all, and the Mana Tap ability was a fairly fast and efficient way to do it, which is why it comes in at number 3. And at number 2 is the original Draenei racial ability called Heroic Presence. The racial increased the chances by 1% for the player and all party members within 30 yards. This passive racial was added in the Burning Crusade and along with the Draenei race itself. Several of the abilities on this list come from the Burning Crusade because Blizzard didn't really know how to balance new racial abilities with existing ones. After all, this was the first time new playable races had been added to the game, and Blizz devs were learning as they went along. More playable character races would not be added until Cataclysm, after several big changes to game mechanics and player resources, making it easier to level out the field of all racial abilities in the game. And even then, there were outliers. These changes to the game have been brought up because in WoW's second expansion, Wrath of the Lich King, both physical hit and spell hit stats were merged into just the hit stat. This ability obviously affected the Draenei racial Heroic Presence, which now granted 1% hit to both physical and spell damage. What makes Heroic Presence so unique is that it's the only racial in the history of the game to be aura based. Most players will be familiar with auras from the buffs from paladins or hunter aspects. An aura is an instant buff that is automatically applied from the player to all the other players within a certain distance of them, and in both TBC and Wrath, the 1% hit buff applied to all players within 30 yards of the player. This meant that as long as an alliance party had any Draenei in their group, they could calculate a 1% extra hit rating to their gearing, so long as they remain within 30 yards of that Draenei. Wrath saw the height of this racial ability since Heroic Presence now also included spell hit. Heroic Presence became significantly less heroic when Cataclysm came out, and the racial no longer applied to other party members, but only to the Draenei players themselves. Finally, the hit mechanic was essentially removed entirely from the game in WoD, and just increased strength, agility, and intellect by a certain amount that's scaled with level. This WoD version of the ability has remained the same ever since. And finally, at number 1, we have the Blood Elf racial Arcane Torrent. Although we briefly touched on this while discussing the mana tap in the number 3 spot, we held off on the description for a reason. Arcane Torrent has a long and interesting history. First added in TBC for obvious reasons, Arcane Torrent is both a silence and an instant resource generator. While in the Burning Crusade, it became more effective with a higher number of buffs from mana tap, ranging from 0 to 3 stacks, increasing its effect. This ability was also instant cast and required no resource other than the optional consumable buffs from mana tap to make it stronger. In the Burning Crusade, when Arcane Torrent was cast without any mana tap buffs, it would silence all enemies in 8 yards for 2 seconds, and return no mana to the player. Consuming 1 or 2 charges of mana tap strengthened Arcane Torrent by making the silence grow longer, its AoE grow bigger, and its resource regeneration grow as well. And if all 3 buffs were consumed, all enemies within 25 yards would be silenced for 4 seconds. And in addition, you also got a surge of mana back, making it very useful for the mana-thirsty Blood Elf classes, but this also meant it was useful for all those Blood Elf rogues as they would give you energy back as well. So not only did the Arcane Torrent ability have so many different aspects of its mechanics, it also changed gameplay depending on what class the Blood Elf was as well. All of this is a bit complicated to remember, but don't forget mana tap also had a cooldown of 30 seconds, meaning it would take at least 90 seconds to build up all 3 charges, assuming the cooldown of Arcane Torrent was ready. All of this makes it really easy to see why Blizzard devs ended up removing mana tap and gave Arcane Torrent a flat effect in Wrath, as it really was so complicated it could be its own class mechanic instead of a racial. In Wrath, Arcane Torrent's tooltip was changed to silence all enemies within 8 yards for 2 seconds and restores 6% of your mana. Non-player victim spellcasting is also interrupted for 3 seconds. So, what makes Arcane Torrent so overpowered? Well, first, it's a huge AoE silence, and also is instant cast, meaning it can't be interrupted, which was true for all interrupts, but the fact it was AoE made it terrifying. Second, it also counts as an attack, meaning it could break most CC effects as well as even pull enemy rogues and druids out of hiding. Over the years, Arcane Torrent largely remained unchanged, with new resources being added for the new Blood Elf classes and specs. Arcane Torrent was completely changed when the Battle for Azeroth expansion launched, however. In BfA, Arcane Torrent was completely reworked, so it only removed 1 beneficial effect from all enemies within 8 yards, and restored 3% of the player's resource, which these days means literally nothing for anyone but arcane mages and healers. This remains the ability's description as a Dragonflight with the time the script was made. So, what happened to cause such a beloved and OP instant cast silence to be lost forever? Well, in short, Mythic Plus happened. The AoE interrupt from Arcane Torrent was just too overpowered for Mythic Plus specifically, since it made quick work of trash packs and all the casts and mobs in a wide area, as an AoE interrupt alone is very powerful, but having it set to your race meant you could have tons of interrupts if you had a whole group of Blood Elves. In fact, the very first Mythic Dungeon Invitational occurred shortly after this change to Arcane Torrent. Let us not forget the fact that a vast majority of Horde players played Blood Elves, and this change removed an interrupt from gameplay for a large portion of the Horde. While Arcane Torrent was not the only racial CC in the game, for example there's War Stomp from the Taurens, it was the only instant cast one, so it had to go. Many Blood Elf players are still bitter about this change, and for good reason. It was arguably one of the most overpowered racials in the game, and it had the longest running time as the removed racial in the game's history as well. As an interesting aside, this change to Arcane Torrent in BfA made it very similar thematically to our original Blood Elf Priest racial, Consume Magic, which had existed in TBC, removing beneficial effects in order to gain mana, and for Blood Elf Priests, it was especially useful to use this with your Touch of Weakness spell to gain back mana if it was no longer needed. So at least Blizzard tried to lessen the punch by bringing back an older ability, but in a different way. Okay. Well, that pretty much does it for this video. As always, thank you for watching, and let me know what other topics you want me to cover in future videos.